The autumn morning mist clung to the marble columns of my estate like the weight of unfinished promises upon my soul. I am Lord Edmund Hartwell, Viscount of Althbury, 29 years of age, and as I stood among these ancient pillars that had witnessed 3 generations of my family's joys and sorrows, I carried within my chest a burden heavier than any military pack I had shouldered during my years of service to the Crown. The gardens of Hartwell Manor stretched before me in their late-season splendor, golden leaves carpeting the perfectly manicured pathways like nature's own tribute to the passage of time. Each step I took upon the gravel sent small echoes through the crisp air, a sound that seemed to mock the silence that had settled over my heart since returning from the continent. The neoclassical columns, erected by my grandfather in his youth, stood as silent sentinels among the boxwood hedges, their weathered surfaces telling stories of countless seasons, countless homecomings that had been far more joyous than mine. I paused beside the central fountain, its gentle murmur the only voice that dared to speak in this cathedral of memory. The water caught the morning light, sending dancing reflections across the carved stone faces of cherubs whose innocent smiles seemed to reproach me for the darkness I harbored. In my coat pocket, wrapped in oiled cloth against the dampness of travel, lay the reason for my torment. Letters. Personal effects. The final words of a man who had saved my life at Waterloo, only to lose his own 3 months later to the fever that claimed so many of our brave soldiers in the aftermath of victory. Captain James Blackwood had been more than my fellow officer. He had been my dearest friend since our school days at Eton, a man whose laughter could lighten the darkest campaign tent, whose courage in battle was matched only by his kindness to those beneath his station. When the fever took hold of him in that wretched field hospital outside Brussels, his final coherent words had been a plea that haunts me still. He had gripped my hand with what little strength remained to him and whispered, "Edmund, promise me you will see to Cordelia. Promise me you will deliver my words to her personally, not through some cold military dispatch." I had given that promise without hesitation, as any honorable man would to his dying friend. Yet now, 2 months after burying James in Belgian soil, I found myself hesitating at the very threshold of fulfilling that sacred duty. What was it about this task that filled me with such inexplicable dread? Perhaps it was the knowledge that in meeting his widow, I would be forced to confront the reality of his loss all over again. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something I dared not examine too closely in the harsh light of morning. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew me from my brooding contemplation. My butler, old Pemberton, emerged from the manor house with measured steps, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had served the Hartwell family for 40 years and had learned to read the moods of its masters with uncommon accuracy. "My lord," he said, offering a slight bow, "the horses are prepared for your journey to Millbrook village. Shall I have the carriage brought around?" "No, Pemberton. I shall ride alone today. The morning air will do me good, and I prefer to approach this obligation without the formal trappings of my station." The old man's eyes, sharp as a hawk's despite his advancing years, studied me with the familiarity of long service. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but might I suggest that calling upon a lady in mourning requires a certain degree of ceremony? Mrs. Blackwood will expect." "Mrs. Blackwood," I interrupted, perhaps more sharply than I intended, "has been through quite enough ceremony and formality to last a lifetime. I suspect what she needs now is genuine human compassion, not empty social rituals." Pemberton nodded, though I detected a flicker of concern in his expression. "As you wish, my lord. However, I should mention that you are not the first gentleman to inquire about Mrs. Blackwood's residence in recent weeks. A Mr. Percival Thornfield called here 3 days past, asking rather pointed questions about your intentions regarding the widow." The name struck me like a physical blow. Thornfield. James had mentioned his cousin on several occasions, always with a particular tightness around his eyes that spoke of family discord. I recalled now the letters James had received during our campaigns, letters that had invariably left him brooding and short-tempered for days afterward. What manner of questions did Mr. Thornfield ask? He seemed most interested in whether you had been corresponding with Mrs. Blackwood, and whether you had visited her since your return from the continent. I took the liberty of providing no information beyond confirming your safe return to England. I trust one acted appropriately. More than appropriately, Pemberton. You acted with perfect discretion. I turned my gaze back to the columns, their marble surfaces now fully illuminated by the strengthening sun. Did this Thornfield gentleman indicate the nature of his interest in Mrs. Blackwood? He claimed to be concerned for her welfare, being family and all. However. Pemberton paused, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who had learned that discretion was often more valuable than gold. However, his manner suggested interests that extended beyond mere familial concern. He asked specifically about the terms of Captain Blackwood's will and whether the widow had received any guidance regarding her future security. A cold understanding began to settle over me like morning frost. Thornfield was not merely concerned about his cousin's widow, he was calculating. The realization brought with it a surge of protective anger that surprised me with its intensity. James had never spoken of his wife in terms that suggested deep romantic attachment, but he had always referred to her with genuine affection and respect. The thought that she might now be vulnerable to the machinations of a man like Thornfield stirred something fierce within me. "Pemberton, what do you know of Mrs. Blackwood's current circumstances?" "Only what the village gossips have carried to the servants' hall, my lord. They say she is a woman of uncommon intelligence and quiet dignity, that she managed the household with remarkable skill during the captain's long absences, and that she has borne her loss with admirable fortitude. They also say—" He hesitated again. "Speak plainly, man." "They say she is a woman of unusual appearance, my lord. Not in any way that diminishes her worth, you understand, but she bears certain marks from her past that make her the subject of considerable speculation among those with nothing better to occupy their minds." I felt my jaw tighten with anger at the thought of idle tongues wagging about a grieving widow's appearance. "What manner of marks?" "A limp, my lord, from some childhood misfortune. And hair that has gone prematurely silver, though she is said to be no more than 26 years of age. The gossips attribute it to the shock of her husband's death, though others claim it began during his final campaign, when the worry grew too heavy for her to bear. 26 years old, bearing the silver threads of grief in her hair, walking with the measured gait of old pain. The image that formed in my mind was not one of diminished beauty, but of a woman who had been marked by life's trials and had somehow transformed those marks into a unique form of grace. I found myself unexpectedly eager to meet this Cordelia Blackwood, to see for myself the woman who had inspired such devotion in my dear friend. "Have the bay gelding saddled, Pemberton. I ride for Millbrook village within the hour." "Very good, my lord." "And sir? May I say that Captain Blackwood chose his friend well? He would be proud to see you honoring your word to him." As I watched the old butler make his way back to the house, I touched the packet of letters in my coat once more. "James," I thought, "I pray I have the wisdom to serve your memory well, and the strength to face whatever truths await me among those garden columns where your widow tends her solitary grief." The ride to Millbrook village took me through countryside that seemed painted by an artist's brush dipped in autumn's finest pigments. Golden fields stretched toward distant hills shrouded in morning mist, while ancient oak trees displayed their seasonal crowns of amber and rust. The bay gelding beneath me moved with eager strides, as if sensing my own mixture of anticipation and apprehension about the task ahead. Each mile that passed brought me closer to a moment I had both dreaded and, if I were honest with myself, inexplicably anticipated. Millbrook village appeared before me like something from a pastoral poem, its thatched cottages and stone church spire rising from the valley floor with timeless serenity. Smoke curled lazily from countless chimneys, carrying the scent of burning oak and the promise of hearth-warmed comfort within. Yet as I guided my horse through the narrow streets, I felt anything but comforted. The weight of James's letters seemed to grow heavier with each step, and I found myself rehearsing words that felt inadequate to the magnitude of my mission. The blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man whose leather apron bore the honest stains of his trade, directed me to Rosemere Cottage with a respectful nod when I mentioned Mrs. Blackwood's name. His expression held the particular mixture of sympathy and curiosity that small villages reserve for those touched by tragedy, and I detected in his eyes the same protective regard that Pemberton had mentioned. It seemed that Cordelia Blackwood had earned the genuine affection of her neighbors, a testament to her character that spoke well of James's judgment. Rosemere Cottage sat at the village's edge, surrounded by gardens that even in their autumn decline showed evidence of careful tending and artistic vision. The house itself was modest but elegant, built of honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the strengthening sunlight. What drew my immediate attention, however, were the classical columns that graced the small garden behind the cottage. They were not grand like those at Hartwell Manor, but they possessed a refined beauty that spoke of cultured taste and perhaps limited means applied with maximum effect. I dismounted and secured my horse to the garden gate, my heart beating with an intensity that surprised me. Through the morning air came the soft sound of movement among the plantings, and I realized that Mrs. Blackwood was indeed tending her garden. For a moment, I hesitated, struck by the peculiar intimacy of approaching a woman in her private sanctuary of grief. Yet James's final words echoed in my memory, and I forced myself forward along the gravel path. She appeared among the columns like a vision from a classical painting, and I understood immediately why the village gossips had spoken of her unusual appearance. Her hair, indeed silver-streaked despite her youth, was arranged in a simple style that emphasized rather than concealed its premature coloring. Far from diminishing her beauty, it lent her an ethereal quality that took my breath away. When she turned at the sound of my approach, I saw eyes of the clearest gray, intelligent and alert, set in a face that bore the refined bones of true elegance. Her movements as she rose from where she had been kneeling among the plantings revealed the slight limp that Pemberton had mentioned, but there was nothing pitiful about her gait. Instead, she moved with a measured grace that spoke of dignity hard-won through adversity. She wore mourning dress of the finest black wool, but it was cut with subtle style that suggested a woman who understood that grief need not mean the abandonment of all aesthetic sense. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, removing my hat and offering a bow appropriate to her station. "I am Edmund Hartwell, Viscount of Althbury. I served with your late husband and have come to fulfill a promise I made to him." Her grey eyes studied me with an intensity that was both disconcerting and strangely pleasant. I had the distinct impression that she was taking my measure with the same careful attention she might give to a complex passage in a book of philosophy. When she spoke, her voice held a musical quality that made the simple words seem almost like poetry. "Lord Hartwell," she said, offering a curtsy that managed to be both respectful and dignified without any hint of subservience. "James spoke of you often in his letters. He said you were the finest man he had ever known, and that your friendship was one of the greatest blessings of his military service." The sincerity in her words struck me like a physical blow, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion I had thought myself too disciplined to display. "Your husband was too generous in his praise, madam. The truth is that I owe him my life, and that debt can never be fully repaid." She gestured toward a small stone bench positioned between two of the columns, where morning sunlight created a natural alcove of warmth. "Perhaps you would join me?" I confess that I have been eager to meet the man who meant so much to James, though I feared such a meeting might never come to pass. As we seated ourselves, I became acutely aware of her proximity and the faint scent of lavender that seemed to emanate from her person. There was something profoundly peaceful about her presence, as if grief had refined rather than broken her spirit. I found myself studying the delicate architecture of her profile as she gazed toward the memorial garden she had created among the columns. "This space," she said, following my gaze, "has become my sanctuary. James always loved classical design, and I thought he would appreciate the symbolism of columns representing strength and permanence. I tend his memorial plantings here each morning, finding in the work a kind of communion with his memory." The memorial garden was a masterpiece of subtle design, featuring plantings that would provide beauty in every season. Evergreen shrubs formed the backbone, while carefully chosen perennials promised spring renewal. A small marble tablet, bearing only James's name and dates, served as the focal point without overwhelming the natural beauty of the space. "He would indeed appreciate both the beauty and the thoughtfulness," I replied, reaching into my coat for the packet of letters. "Mrs. Blackwood, James asked me to deliver these to you personally. They are his final words, written during his last weeks when the fever had not yet claimed his clarity of mind." Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the packet, and I noticed how carefully she held the oiled cloth as if it contained something infinitely precious. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of autumn leaves. "I had hoped, that is, I had wondered if he might have left some final message." "There is more," I continued, feeling the weight of responsibility settle upon my shoulders. "He spoke of you often during our campaigns, always with the greatest affection and respect. In his final conscious moments, he asked me to ensure your welfare and happiness. I want you to know that I consider this request a sacred trust." She looked up at me then, and I saw tears gathering in those remarkable grey eyes. "You are very kind, Lord Hartwell, but I fear James may have painted too generous a picture of our union. Ours was an arranged marriage, entered into for reasons of practical necessity rather than romantic attachment. While I held him in the highest esteem and did everything in my power to make him comfortable and happy, I would not wish you to labor under any false impressions about the nature of our relationship." Her honesty struck me as both refreshing and heartbreaking. Here was a woman who refused to romanticize her past even in the face of social expectations that would have made such romanticism both acceptable and advantageous. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said carefully, "whatever the original foundations of your marriage, James spoke of you with genuine warmth and deep respect. He worried about your future and wanted to ensure that you would be protected and provided for. That concern came from real affection, regardless of how your union began. A small smile touched her lips, transforming her face with unexpected radiance. "You have your friend's generous heart, my lord." James always sought to see the best in every situation, even when circumstances were far from ideal. Before I could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted our conversation. Both of us turned toward the garden gate, where a rider was dismounting with the confident manner of one accustomed to making himself at home wherever he chose to appear. The gentleman was perhaps 40 years of age, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of careful attention to fashion and considerable investment in his wardrobe. His dark hair was immaculately styled, and his coat bore the unmistakable cut of London's finest tailors. Mrs. Blackwood's posture stiffened beside me, and I noticed how her hands unconsciously tightened around James's letters. "Mr. Thornfield," she said, her voice carrying a note of resignation that made my protective instincts stir. "I was not expecting you today." So this was the cousin whose presence had troubled James and whose recent inquiries had alerted Pemberton. As Percival Thornfield approached our secluded alcove among the columns, I found myself taking an instant and powerful dislike to the man. There was something calculating in his pale blue eyes, something predatory in the way his gaze moved between Mrs. Blackwood and myself, as if he were assessing the threat I might represent to whatever plans he harbored. Thornfield's smile as he approached was the sort that never quite reached the eyes, a practiced expression that spoke of social climbing and calculated charm. He swept his hat from his head in an elaborate gesture that seemed designed more for show than genuine courtesy, and his bow toward Mrs. Blackwood lingered just long enough to suggest familiarity that bordered on presumption. "My dear Cordelia," he said, and I noticed how Mrs. Blackwood's jaw tightened at his use of her Christian name without invitation. "How lovely to find you entertaining in your garden. And this must be the distinguished Lord Hartwell I have heard so much about." His gaze fixed upon me with undisguised assessment, like a merchant evaluating goods he might wish to purchase. I rose to my feet, offering the minimal courtesy that politeness demanded while making no effort to disguise my displeasure at the interruption. "Mr. Thornfield, I presume." I was just paying my respects to Mrs. Blackwood and fulfilling a promise to her late husband. "Ah yes, dear James," Thornfield replied, though his tone suggested anything but affection for his deceased cousin. "Such a tragedy, losing him so young. But life must go on, mustn't it? And dear Cordelia cannot remain forever in mourning, isolated from society and proper guidance." The way he spoke about Mrs. Blackwood as if she were not present, combined with his casual dismissal of her grief, made my hands clench involuntarily. Beside me, I could sense her discomfort growing with each word he spoke, and I found myself moving slightly closer to her, a gesture of protection that was entirely unconscious but felt completely natural. "I hardly consider myself isolated, Mr. Thornfield," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice maintaining its musical quality despite the tension I could hear beneath the surface. "I have my books, my garden, and the friendship of my neighbors. I want for very little. But my dear girl," Thornfield continued with that infuriating smile, "books and gardens are poor substitutes for proper companionship and guidance. A woman in your position requires the protection of family, the security that comes from making practical decisions about her future." The word "practical" fell from his lips like a stone into still water, sending ripples of implication that made my stomach turn. I had heard enough veiled proposals in drawing rooms to recognize one when it masqueraded as familial concern, and the presumption of this man astounded me. "Mrs. Blackwood seems quite capable of managing her own affairs," I interjected, allowing a note of steel to enter my voice. "I see no evidence that she requires guidance beyond what her own excellent judgment provides." Thornfield's pale eyes fixed on me with sudden sharpness, and I saw the calculation there become more focused, more dangerous. "Lord Hartwell, surely as a man of the world you understand that a widow's position is inherently precarious? Without proper male protection, she becomes vulnerable to all manner of unseemly attention." The hypocrisy of his words, coming from a man whose own attention toward Mrs. Blackwood was clearly the most unseemly thing in her current situation, made my temper flare. I was about to respond when Mrs. Blackwood herself spoke, her voice carrying a note of quiet authority that commanded attention. "Gentlemen, perhaps we might postpone this discussion of my future welfare for another time? Lord Hartwell has honored me with a visit to deliver my husband's final correspondence, and I should like to give that matter the attention it deserves." Her diplomatic intervention was masterful, but I could see the strain it cost her to maintain such composure in the face of Thornfield's pressure. The man, however, seemed oblivious to the hint that his presence was unwelcome. "Of course, my dear," he said, settling himself on another bench as if planning an extended stay. "I should be delighted to remain and ensure that you receive proper support during what must be an emotionally trying conversation." The presumption was breathtaking, and I saw Mrs. Blackwood's grey eyes flash with anger before she regained control of her expression. It occurred to me that this scene had likely played out many times before, with Thornfield inserting himself into her private affairs under the guise of family concern while steadily undermining her independence and peace of mind. I decided to take a more direct approach. "Mr. Thornfield, I'm sure you understand that the contents of a soldier's final letters to his widow are of a deeply personal nature. Perhaps you might allow Mrs. Blackwood and myself to conclude our business in private?" His smile became even more unpleasant, if such a thing were possible. "Lord Hartwell, I appreciate your consideration, but as James's closest male relative and Cordelia's natural protector, I have both the right and the responsibility to ensure her interests are properly safeguarded." I felt my control slipping and was preparing to inform Mr. Thornfield exactly what I thought of his assumed authority when Mrs. Blackwood surprised us both by rising gracefully to her feet. "Mr. Thornfield," she said, her voice carrying a firmness that brooked no argument, "I thank you for your concern, but I must insist that you respect my privacy in this matter. Lord Hartwell has travelled some distance to honour a promise to my husband, and common courtesy demands that I receive his message without interference." For a moment, Thornfield's mask slipped, and I saw the cold anger beneath his practiced charm. His gaze moved between Mrs. Blackwood and myself with undisguised hostility, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a subtle threat that made my protective instincts surge. "Very well, Cordelia. I shall respect your wishes in this matter, though I fear you may be making decisions without fully understanding their implications." He turned to me with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Lord Hartwell, I trust you will remember that Mrs. Blackwood's reputation is a delicate thing, and that frequent visits from unmarried gentlemen might be misinterpreted by those less generous in their judgments than myself." The implicit threat was clear as crystal, and I felt my jaw clench with the effort required to maintain my composure. This man was attempting to intimidate both Mrs. Blackwood and myself through the weapon of social scandal, using society's harsh judgment of widows as a tool to isolate her and force her into dependence upon his questionable protection. "Mr. Thornfield," I replied, allowing my voice to carry the full weight of my aristocratic authority, "I am quite capable of conducting myself with appropriate discretion, and I would suggest that Mrs. Blackwood's reputation is best served by allowing her to receive the support and friendship of honourable people rather than by attempting to isolate her from all social contact." He studied me for a long moment, and I could see him reassessing the situation. Perhaps he had not expected resistance from James's friend, or perhaps he had underestimated both Mrs. Blackwood's strength and my own determination to honour my promise to her husband. "Of course," he said finally, replacing his hat with another elaborate flourish. "I merely wished to ensure that proper consideration was given to all aspects of the situation." He turned back to Mrs. Blackwood with what appeared to be genuine affection but which I now recognized as possessive calculation. "My dear Cordelia, I shall call upon you tomorrow to continue our discussion about your future arrangements. There are certain legal matters regarding James's estate that require immediate attention." Mrs. Blackwood's face had gone pale at his words, and I noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she clutched James's letters. "Legal matters, Mr. Thornfield? Nothing to concern yourself with today," he replied with false reassurance. "We shall discuss everything tomorrow when you have had time to recover from the emotional strain of today's revelations." As Thornfield mounted his horse and rode away, I found myself wondering what legal complications he might be referring to, and why the mention of them had caused such obvious distress in Mrs. Blackwood. The afternoon sun was growing stronger, but I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Whatever game Percival Thornfield was playing, it was clear that Mrs. Blackwood was caught in the middle of it, and that my promise to James might involve far more than simply delivering letters and offering comfort. The silence that followed Thornfield's departure hung between us like morning mist, heavy with unspoken concerns and growing awareness of dangers neither of us had fully anticipated. Mrs. Blackwood remained standing, her grey eyes fixed on the spot where Thornfield had disappeared around the garden gate, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing had become carefully controlled as if she were fighting to maintain her composure. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said gently, "perhaps you would prefer to postpone reading James's letters until you have had time to recover from that unpleasant encounter?" She turned to me then, and I was struck by the mixture of gratitude and determination in her expression. "On the contrary, Lord Hartwell. I find that I need more than ever to hear my husband's final words." Perhaps they will provide some guidance for the difficulties that seem to be gathering around me like storm clouds. We returned to our seats among the columns, and I watched as she carefully unwrapped the oiled cloth with trembling fingers. The packet contained 3 letters, each written in James's familiar hand but showing the weakness that had crept into his penmanship as the fever progressed. She held them reverently for a moment before breaking the seal on the first. As she read, I found myself studying her profile in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the remaining autumn leaves. There was something indefinably moving about watching her absorb her husband's final thoughts, seeing the play of emotions across her delicate features as she encountered his words of affection, concern, and final instructions. Occasionally, a tear would escape and trace a silver path down her cheek, but she read with the focused attention of someone who understood the precious nature of what she held. "He writes of you," she said suddenly, looking up from the second letter. "He says that you saved his life more than once, not just at Waterloo but throughout your friendship. He calls you the brother he never had, and says that if anything should happen to him, he would trust you above all others to see to my welfare." The words hit me with unexpected force, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. "Your husband was far too generous in his assessment of my character, Mrs. Blackwood. If anything, it was his friendship that saved me, providing light during the darkest moments of our campaigns." She smiled then, an expression of such warmth that it seemed to transform the entire garden around us. "I think you both saved each other, Lord Hartwell. True friendship has that quality, does it not? Each person becomes stronger because of the other's presence." Before I could respond, she had returned to the final letter, and I watched as her expression gradually changed from peaceful attention to growing alarm. Her face grew pale, and her hands began to shake so violently that I feared she might drop the precious paper. "Mrs. Blackwood, what is it? What has distressed you so?" She looked up at me with eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. "Lord Hartwell, I fear I may have been living under a terrible misapprehension about my circumstances. James writes here about certain provisions he made for my future, legal arrangements that were to take effect upon his death. But Mr. Thornfield has told me repeatedly that James died without making any such provisions, that the estate passes entirely to him as the closest male relative." A cold understanding began to dawn upon me, and I felt anger surge through my veins like liquid fire. "Mrs. Blackwood, may I ask what specific provisions James mentions in his letter?" "He speaks of documents he filed with his solicitor in London, arrangements that would provide me with an annual income and the right to remain in Rosemere Cottage for as long as I wished. He also mentioned certain investments he made on my behalf, funds that were to be held in trust to ensure my independence." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "But Mr. Thornfield has repeatedly assured me that no such documents exist, that James died intestate and that I am entirely dependent upon his generosity for my continued residence here." The scope of Thornfield's deception was breathtaking in its audacity. Not only was he attempting to manipulate Mrs. Blackwood into dependence upon him, but he was apparently concealing legal documents that would ensure her financial independence. The man was not merely an opportunist but a criminal. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm despite the rage building within me, "I think it would be wise for us to contact James's solicitor immediately to inquire about these documents. Do you recall the name of his legal representative?" "Mr. Harrison Whitmore of Lincoln's Inn," she replied without hesitation. "James mentioned him frequently in his letters, always with great respect and trust." "Excellent. I know Whitmore by reputation. He is a man of impeccable integrity and considerable skill. I suggest we dispatch a message to him immediately, requesting copies of any documents pertaining to your late husband's estate." Mrs. Blackwood's relief was palpable, but it was quickly replaced by a new concern. "Lord Hartwell, if Mr. Thornfield has indeed been concealing these documents, what might he do when he learns that I am investigating the matter? He seemed quite determined in his attentions today, and I fear that desperation might make him dangerous." Her concern was well-founded, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle upon my shoulders like a familiar military burden. James had asked me to see to her welfare, and it was becoming clear that this task would require more than simply delivering letters and offering comfort. "Mrs. Blackwood, I want you to know that you are not alone in this matter. I gave James my word that I would see to your protection and happiness, and I intend to honor that promise fully. If Thornfield is indeed attempting to defraud you of your rightful inheritance, then he will find that he has made a powerful enemy." The autumn afternoon had grown cooler, and storm clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon, casting shifting shadows across the garden columns. As if responding to the changing weather, Mrs. Blackwood drew her shawl more closely around her shoulders, but her grey eyes held a new light of hope and determination. "I cannot tell you what your support means to me, Lord Hartwell. These past months, I have felt so isolated, so uncertain about my future. Mr. Thornfield's constant visits and veiled threats have made me question my own judgment and memory. To learn that James did indeed make provisions for my welfare, and to have your assistance in claiming what is rightfully mine, feels like emerging from a long nightmare into daylight." The gratitude in her voice stirred something deep within me, something that went far beyond the simple obligation I owed to James's memory. Sitting here among these classical columns, watching the play of emotions across her remarkable face, I found myself drawn to Cordelia Blackwood in ways that both thrilled and terrified me. She was intelligent, courageous, and possessed of a quiet dignity that made her premature silver hair seem like a crown rather than a mark of sorrow. Yet I was acutely aware of the delicacy of my position. She was a recent widow, vulnerable and dependent upon my assistance. Any romantic feelings I might be developing were entirely inappropriate, potentially harmful to her reputation, and possibly unwelcome. The last thing I wanted was to become another man attempting to take advantage of her circumstances, even if my intentions were honorable. The sound of distant thunder drew our attention to the darkening sky, and I realized that I should take my leave before the threatening storm arrived. Yet the thought of leaving her alone to face whatever schemes Thornfield might devise filled me with reluctance. "Mrs. Blackwood, I fear I must return to Hartwell Manor before this storm breaks, but I want you to know that I will dispatch a message to Mr. Whitmore first thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, if Mr. Thornfield should call upon you again, I urge you to be cautious in your responses. Do not commit to any agreements or sign any documents until we have had the opportunity to investigate your true legal position." She rose gracefully as I prepared to take my leave, and for a moment we stood facing each other among the columns with the approaching storm painting dramatic shadows across the garden. The air between us seemed charged with more than the electricity of the coming tempest, and I found myself memorizing every detail of this moment, knowing that it marked a turning point in both our lives. If you're watching from somewhere beautiful today, let me know in the comments where you're joining us from. Now, where was I? Ah yes, standing among those garden columns, feeling the weight of a promise that was becoming something far more complex than either James or I could have anticipated when it was first made. The storm that had threatened all afternoon finally broke as I reached the halfway point between Millbrook Village and Hartwell Manor, sending sheets of cold rain across the countryside and forcing me to seek shelter in an abandoned shepherd's cottage until the worst of it passed. As I sat listening to the thunder roll across the hills, my mind raced with plans and possibilities, each more urgent than the last. The image of Cordelia's face when she had read James's final letter haunted me, the mixture of relief and fear in her grey eyes spurring me to action with an intensity that surprised me. By the time I reached home, soaked despite my temporary shelter, Pemberton was waiting with hot towels and concerned efficiency. As I changed into dry clothes, I dictated an urgent message to Mr. Whitmore, requesting immediate information about any legal documents James Blackwood might have filed regarding his wife's future provision. I also penned a second letter to my own solicitor in London, asking him to make discreet inquiries about Percival Thornfield's financial circumstances and any legal actions that might have been taken against him. The following morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean of yesterday's troubles. I was taking my morning coffee in the library when Pemberton announced an unexpected visitor. Mr. Harrison Whitmore himself stood in my doorway, a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 60 years whose silver hair and intelligent eyes spoke of wisdom earned through decades of legal practice. "Lord Hartwell," he said, accepting my invitation to join me for breakfast, "your message reached me at a most opportune moment. I had been planning to travel to this region on a matter of considerable urgency involving Mrs. Blackwood's estate." My heart leaped with hope and anticipation. "Mr. Whitmore, I cannot tell you how relieved I am to see you. Mrs. Blackwood has been led to believe that her husband died without making any provision for her future, but his final letters suggest otherwise." Whitmore's expression grew grave as he removed a leather portfolio from his traveling case. "Lord Hartwell, I fear that Mrs. Blackwood has been the victim of a most elaborate and criminal deception. Captain Blackwood not only made extensive provisions for his wife's future but also took the precaution of filing duplicate copies with my firm specifically because he distrusted his cousin's character." The relief that flooded through me was so intense that I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. What manner of provisions did James make? Quite generous ones, actually. An annual income of £800, derived from investments he made during his military service, the cottage and its grounds held in perpetual trust for her use, and a substantial sum set aside for any children that might result from a future marriage. Whitmore paused, his expression darkening. There is also a letter, sealed and marked for Mrs. Blackwood's eyes only, that Captain Blackwood left in my care with specific instructions that it be delivered only if circumstances suggested she was being pressured into an unwelcome marriage. The full scope of James's foresight amazed me. Even facing his own mortality, he had thought to protect Cordelia from the very situation she now faced. Mr. Whitmore, how has Mr. Thornfield managed to conceal these documents? Surely Mrs. Blackwood had the right to know of their existence immediately upon her husband's death? Indeed she did, and that is precisely why I have come in person rather than simply responding to your letter. You see, Mr. Thornfield visited my offices 3 months ago, claiming to represent Mrs. Blackwood's interests and requesting that all communication regarding the estate be directed through him. When I insisted upon confirmation from Mrs. Blackwood herself, he produced what appeared to be a letter from her, written in her hand, authorizing him to act on her behalf. A forgery? Almost certainly, though a skillful one. However, Captain Blackwood had shown me examples of his wife's handwriting when he filed the original documents, and I harbored suspicions about the authenticity of the authorization. I wrote directly to Mrs. Blackwood several times, but my letters were apparently intercepted. When no response came, I decided that personal intervention was required. The audacity of Thornfield's scheme was breathtaking, but so was James's prescient planning. Mr. Whitmore, I believe we should travel to Rosemere Cottage immediately. Mrs. Blackwood needs to know the truth of her situation, and I fear that Thornfield may be planning some desperate action now that he realizes his deception is in danger of exposure. Our journey to Millbrook Village was swift, driven by a sense of urgency that proved to be well-founded. As we approached Rosemere Cottage, we could see 2 horses tethered at the garden gate, and the sound of raised voices carried across the autumn air. Thornfield was there, and he was not alone. We dismounted quickly and made our way through the garden toward the sound of the disturbance. Among the classical columns where Cordelia and I had shared such meaningful conversation the day before, a scene of shocking confrontation was unfolding. Thornfield stood facing Mrs. Blackwood with another gentleman beside him, a thin, pale man whose clerical collar identified him as a minister. Mrs. Blackwood, still in her morning dress but with her silver-streaked hair disheveled, was backing away from them with obvious distress. "No, Mr. Thornfield," she was saying, her voice carrying a note of desperation I had never heard before. "I have told you repeatedly that I am not ready to consider remarriage. I require more time to grieve my husband properly." "My dear Cordelia," Thornfield replied with false patience, "time is a luxury you can no longer afford. The creditors are demanding immediate payment of James's debts, and marriage to me is the only way to preserve your security and reputation. Reverend Morrison has kindly agreed to perform the ceremony immediately, given the urgent circumstances." The minister, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings, shifted nervously from foot to foot. "Mr. Thornfield, perhaps if the lady requires more time to consider." "There is no more time," Thornfield snapped, his mask of charm finally slipping completely. "The law is quite clear about the obligations of intestate estates, and Mrs. Blackwood's continued resistance to practical necessity serves no one's interests." It was at this moment that Mr. Whitmore and I stepped into view, and the effect upon the assembled group was immediate and dramatic. Thornfield's face went white as parchment when he recognized the solicitor, while Mrs. Blackwood's expression transformed from despair to blazing hope. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice trembling with relief, "thank God you have come." "Mrs. Blackwood," the solicitor replied with grave courtesy, "I deeply regret that you have been subjected to such distress. I am here to inform you that your late husband made extensive and generous provision for your future, including an annual income that will ensure your complete independence for the remainder of your life." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Thornfield stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as the full implications of his exposure settled upon him. The minister looked from one face to another with growing understanding of the deception he had nearly participated in. And Mrs. Blackwood, blessed Mrs. Blackwood, stood among those ancient columns with tears of relief streaming down her face. "Furthermore," Whitmore continued, his voice carrying the full weight of legal authority, "I must inform Mr. Thornfield that intercepting private correspondence and forging legal documents are serious criminal offenses. I suggest he remove himself from Mrs. Blackwood's property immediately and seek legal counsel regarding his precarious position." Thornfield's departure was swift and ignominious, the minister following closely behind with profuse apologies for his unwitting participation in the attempted deception. And then there were 3 of us among the columns, with the autumn sunlight streaming through the trees and the promise of justice finally being served. Mrs. Blackwood turned to me with such gratitude and joy in her grey eyes that I felt my heart skip several beats. Lord Hartwell, how can I ever thank you? Without your intervention, I might have been forced into a marriage that would have made me miserable for the rest of my life. The thanks belong entirely to James, I replied, though I found myself stepping closer to her among those graceful columns. His foresight and love protected you even beyond the grave. Yet as I spoke those words, I realized that my own feelings for this remarkable woman had grown far beyond the bounds of duty to a fallen friend. Standing there in her garden sanctuary, watching the relief and happiness transform her face, I knew that I was irrevocably in love with Cordelia Blackwood. The question that remained was whether she might ever come to feel the same way about me. Mr. Whitmore, with the discretion born of long experience, excused himself to arrange for the legal transfer of documents and funds. As his carriage disappeared down the village lane, Mrs. Blackwood and I found ourselves alone among the columns once again, but this time with the weight of deception lifted and the future stretching before us bright with possibility. Lord Hartwell, she said softly, her voice carrying a new note I had not heard before, I realize that propriety suggests I should observe a longer period of mourning before even considering the possibility of new attachments. But I find myself wondering if you might consider calling upon me again, not merely as James's friend fulfilling a promise, but as Edmund Hartwell, the man who has shown me such kindness and protection in my darkest hour. The hope and invitation in her words sent joy racing through my veins like sunlight after storm. Mrs. Blackwood, nothing would give me greater pleasure than to court you properly, when you feel ready to receive such attentions. I have come to admire not only your strength and intelligence but also the grace with which you have faced adversity. 6 months later, on a spring morning when the columns in her garden were wreathed with climbing roses and the memorial plantings bloomed with renewed life, I had the honor of making Cordelia Blackwood my wife. James's sealed letter, opened on our wedding day, contained his blessing for any happiness she might find after his death, and his hope that she would choose love over mere security when the time came for new beginnings. As I look back now on that autumn day when I first walked among those garden columns, I realize that promises made to dying friends sometimes lead us not just to honor the past, but to embrace futures we never dared to imagine. True loyalty to the departed sometimes means having the courage to fully embrace life and love, knowing that those we have lost would want nothing more than our complete happiness. If this story has moved you today, I invite you to subscribe to our channel for more tales of love, honor, and the enduring power of human connection. Until we meet again among the columns of memory and hope, remember that sometimes the most sacred promises are those that teach us to love again.